Welcome to the Spool podcast. Unwind with Dr. Nils Roemer, Dean of the Bass School at UT Dallas.
Good afternoon, Victor Rosenbaum. We are really thrilled to have you here. You've been an educator, a pianist, a composer for many, many decades. Your life has been about music, performing, educating, and we have now a chance to talk to you and learn much about you and what kind of inspired you to become ultimately the kind of force that you became, but also to learn something about your approach to music. But as a historian, I like to begin always where things begin. You were born in 1941, which, for many of us is, from an American perspective, just before probably the United States entered the war, really, really complicated and horrendous period in humanity's history, but also in the US history and obviously also in European history. So coming out of that, you then, however, as a young boy, decided the piano is what drives me. So what interests me, and I want to carry that forward, how much are we individually, or how much is the music that you play shaped by its particular time, and how much is that important to us, or how much is it not? So talk us a little bit through, how you came to become a pianist.
Well, let me first, before I answer that specific question, let me comment on your noting my birth year and the time that was in the history of the United States, because it had something to do with my name. I was born 12 days after Pearl Harbor, and my middle initial is E, so my name is Victory.
Oh, okay.
And that was chosen because we were just at the beginning of our involvement, U.S. involvement in World War II. And that was the rallying cry, Victory.
Victory.
So, thus the name.
Thus the name.
So you like origin stories?
Yes, no, I mean,
that's
that is
going back to the very, very
that
beginning.
Is that's like right from, in the beginning was the hope for victory. And it ultimately came at a far later stage probably than Americans would have assumed at that point.
Yeah.
And at far greater losses, both to Americans as well as obviously many others, including Europeans, and obviously the Holocaust on top of it. But coming out of that, then how does one go from there to piano?
Well, actually, my origin story about piano is also, in a way, tangentially connected to the war, because my father was a doctor and he was in the Army Medical Corps stationed in the South. And as the family story goes, we were at an officers' club when I was about 3 or 4. And there was a piano player playing dinner music in the background. And I went over and stood by him for about an hour. That's what my parents tell me anyway. Fascinated, just glued to this guy playing the piano. And when I came home, I started playing the piano, but on tabletops.
On tabletops and in the air and the likes.
Yeah, pretending to play the piano. And they thought, well, maybe this kid is interested in music. So I got a toy piano, started picking out tunes on the little toy piano. It was about this high. And did that for a while. And they decided, when we moved to Indianapolis, which is where I grew up after the war, I was 5 years old then. And they decided maybe it's time to get a piano and start lessons. And that's what happened. I started lessons at the age of about 5.5.
So one thing that intrigues me, how many of us really ultimately embark on whatever we end up doing based on something, very simple that happens. So in your case, it was this piano player that mesmerized you, and then endless practice on tablecloth and elsewhere. But in truth, Victor, we're just joking around here in the studio a little bit. Lots of young boys or girls start at some point or another playing piano like that, getting a toy piano and getting a real piano. From there to becoming a pianist is still quite a way, right?
Well, it's a progressive process, and my story isn't so different from all those hundreds and thousands of other people who take lessons, except that certain people are lucky to have very good and creative teachers encouraging them. I was talking today to the teachers group in Plano about how to develop musical values in young students and musicality, not just piano playing, but musical meaning and understanding. And I was lucky to have a very creative teacher who cultivated that. But it's also true that regardless of who the teacher is, some people simply take to one activity more than another. Tennis more than baseball, swimming more than acrobatics. And I just took to music. I liked it. I loved it.
But having this approach of teaching music in that way, that it's about, not just mastering a skill of sorts, but really understanding and interpreting music is something that undoubtedly would have been part also of your musical education. When one looks up and down your biography, there's always one of your teachers that often is noted, Rosina Levine, that taught you for
a couple of summers.
Couple of summers.
At a summer
who,
festival.
in her own ways, has a really
Aspen.
interesting biography. But is she the one who taught you not just the skills,
No,
but
as I said, my first piano teacher was very creative about teaching music, not just teaching piano. And she's the one really who got me thinking about phrasing and musical gestures and groups of notes belonging together and expressing something. She also thought it was important to develop the ear, which is the essential part of being a musician. So we were making up things at the piano. We were transposing from one key to another to develop the sense of the ear. And at a certain point, she felt she had done as much as she could in that area, and she found me a composition teacher at the local college, Butler University. And I was taking composition lessons, and that's, music originates in being created.
Right.
First, the music we play has to be written first. There are improvisers who do both. They create and play at the same time. And that's, jazz musicians and many of the great composers of the past, even though we think that their style is what we now call classical music, they were also great improvisers. Beethoven, for example, Bach, Mozart, they could sit down and just play.
But that also says something about you, because one of the things that is obviously always readily associated with you is being a pianist, but you're also a composer. So you quite literally also are creative in that way, not just as an interpreter of things that have been done by others, but you composed by yourself quite a few pieces. So I find this whole idea of interpreting others' work and being creative and about it really interesting, particularly because the pieces that you play, for example, for us, the Beethoven piece, that I think you're going to play for us, has been interpreted by so many other players. But sometimes Beethoven, I think, composes it in 1802, which is kind of an interesting moment in his own time, because he's kind of between, you just mentioned Mozart, right? Stepping out of that shadow as far as the often biography has it, and into his own. He's about to compose the Third Symphony. So the 1802 composition could be interpreted as being on the cusp of this period that we otherwise associate with romanticism, with emotions and all of that, or we could still just kind of scooch it back and say, well, it still kind of stretches out of the classical period. But I think maybe you can kind of demonstrate what that would mean and how you hit those notes in one way or another, but it is ultimately comes down how you, I think you often are credited of approaching this in a very holistic way. Is that right? That you're both the musician, the pianist, but also the historian who kind of intensely studies this. So how does that, in your mind, if you were to think about the Beethoven piece, how does
Well,
that
I was
come?
talking a little bit about that this morning to the piano teachers, or the Music Teachers Association in Plano. The idea of style, not as something that starts at a particular year or a particular day and changes. And I gave the anecdote of having taught a student at a master class who was playing Mozart, for example, in a very rigid way, because apparently he had been taught that Mozart is not to have a lot of effusive emotion. It's very classical, no pedal, no rubato, which is rhythmic flexibility. And so it was sounding very stiff. Every note like a stick figure. Yeah. And I was trying to get him to sing the melody more operatically and more sensitively and a little more flexibly, and encouraging him to play as beautifully as he could, as if he were telling a story. Something with great tenderness and sentiment. And he turned to me and said, "Oh, I didn't know you were allowed to do that in classical music." And I said, "Well, maybe Mozart didn't even know he was classical. He was just writing music that he wanted to express from his heart and soul. And we are the ones who later put labels on things and kind of make the rules for how it should be played." And I even, went so far as to say, do you think if he had composed the piece as you played it, would he have been proud of it? Would he have called his wife in from the kitchen?
Guess what I heard.
And saying, "Constanze, come hear my new piece." And she would say, "Oh, Wolfgang, why do you always write such boring music?"
Probably very true.
And he would say, "But I'm classical."
Yeah.
Of course, this was to make mockery of the idea that style is a rigid rather than evolving phenomenon.
No, very true. And it also, we're compressing really literary movements, philosophical traditions, musical compositions all into one neat little time frame, and say by 1802 it's time for Beethoven to leave one thing behind and move into the next one. And so,
well, as I said, I don't think there's a year or a date when you leave something behind and move in. It's an evolutionary process. And just as Beethoven was moving into new vocabulary and different ways of composing, he was also drawing on some of the elements from earlier music. Like there's aspects of Bach that are very romantic and very expressive. This is a second movement of an Italian concerto by Bach. Just full of lyricism, tenderness, and expressiveness, which is really at the heart of music of all cultures and all periods, and certainly what we call our Western classical music canon. Now, there's also wonderful Elizabethan music in Shakespeare's time, but it's not part of what we're playing all the time in every country of the world now. It's this 250-year period that people in China and in South Africa and in Iceland and in Japan and all over in Europe and all over the world are choosing to play. It was a particularly rich time in the history of music. Just as Rembrandt was a very, very powerful figure in the history of art, Shakespeare in the history of drama. So each art form has its very high periods, and I think that I'm drawn to this music because I really think it's among the best music that exists and the most communicative.
Is it also, with the kind of emphasis in your educational practice that you put on, I think you on and off are credited to say that your students are supposed to find their own voices. So is this music also so ripe for interpretation and kind of such a wonderful space to find one's own kind of interpretation?
Well, I feel very strongly about what music expresses. It means a great deal to me, and I want my students to at least experience what I know and feel about the music. I feel like they already know how to play it their way.
Right.
And they also have the rest of their lives to explore how to play it in their own voice and to come to their own understanding. So I don't feel at all bad about kind of insisting on that they're understanding my point of view at a formative time in their life, so they can experience being stretched beyond what they currently are able to do. Because if they have to play something that is not at the moment natural to them, but it's something I strongly feel, then they're being stretched to expand beyond where they are now. And then they can put that into the mix of influences that shape them as musicians, and they will come out their own person. As I tell them, I typically have you an hour a week. You have yourself
The rest
the
of
rest
your
of
life,
the week
yeah.
and the rest of your life
Yeah.
to explore and become your own person. And they do.
Right.
No two people play exactly alike unless they're trying to imitate a recording or a particular performance hero of theirs, but that doesn't make much sense.
No, that's what what you would say is not even very desirable to
Right.
do exact
We can
identical
learn from listening
imitation.
to others, and hopefully my students learn from listening to me, because when they're listening to me, it's different from listening on YouTube or a recording, because I'm there to explain my thinking behind what I feel and what I understand in the music too. So it's really an intellectual process as well as an intuitive process.
Do you, I mean, just you mentioned YouTube, so I got to go there just for a moment because I'm the Dean of the School of Arts, Humanities, and Technology. So is there, sometimes people are saying now that the way we listen to music is dramatically changing because we're less likely hearing in a concert, we're more likely hearing it at home. When we are hearing it at home, we're increasingly, hearing it with headsets where we're more attentive maybe to little minute details that otherwise would escape us. Do you think you put so much emphasis on listening? So has our listening culture or listening engagement with classical music changed in your mind?
I think overall, in the overview of things, it's a plus. Because 30 years ago, we teachers would be frustrated that our students didn't know the great pianists. You had to go either own the recording or go to a library and sign out a recording, take it home, put it on the record player, and listen. And most people didn't bother with that. And now it's on your phone, and you have access to it. It's created something of a problem in that you almost have too much exposure. Like they learn their pieces from listening to how others do it rather than
Their own.
exploring
Right,
their own
right.
understanding or connecting with the teacher and discussing the process for interpretation. So they listen to a famous concert pianist and they figure, well, if a famous person does it, that must be the right way. And they kind of emulate that. So that's the downside of not developing your own critical thinking and your own analytic thinking about the music.
Well, let's go back to the young Victor and you practicing and learning. One of the things that us, the non-pianist players, are always mesmerized is the ability of musicians to memorize entire pieces. Did you develop this early on, so that if you heard a piece, that you could very quickly absorb it and know how it would be played?
Well, I developed the ability because that's expected
Right.
of performers today, especially pianists and especially solo performers. When you're playing chamber music, for example, with a violin and cello, everybody has the score in front of them, and
Right.
that's generally accepted. So because it's expected, you develop the ability. I don't know how quickly I developed it. I had a pretty good ear, but you practice something for a considerable period of time, and it just, it kind of gets memorized in the process.
But thereby you also, the reason why I'm asking this is you thereby also absorb knowingly or unknowingly how other people have, played certain pieces. And if you then get to play it yourself, you have already the tunes in your head, so to speak.
Well, yes, of course, there are a lot of famous pieces that we all we don't even remember where we heard them
But you
first
heard
because
them
they've
in
always
there.
been, sort of been there at a concert or recording on the radio. You just know. Everybody knows. Everybody
Yes,
knows the
yes.
Fifth Symphony. Do they really know it, or can they just
I always like
recognize,
to play this at faculty meetings, but just to get them in the right
get their
mode,
attention, right?
get their attention,
Well, that was the purpose of
Right.
that opening, to get your
to
attention.
get your attention.
But then Beethoven cleverly built a whole symphony out of those
Right.
four notes
I don't get that far. I just
By-
get their attention.
by relating almost every movement to those four notes in one way or another.
Let me jump in, sorry, since we have you here just for a little bit of time. You also obviously played around the world. I mean, in your bio it says that you traveled across the US, Asia, Europe, Israel, Brazil, Russia. You probably could color code the better part of the map, and chances are you performed in one place or another. Is there over the years, in terms of the practice of performing, something that in your mind has markedly changed, or is that moment when you are in front of an audience with the piano, is that interaction with the audience, has that been largely left unchanged or over the years?
Well, the more you perform, of course, the better you become, or the more acclimated you become to the performance aura, being on stage, waiting backstage. I get nervous before every performance, somewhat, but it's more manageable and controllable than maybe it used to be. But it's something that becomes a more normal part of daily life. One thing about the world today, and it's partly as a result of the technology that you referred to, is that there's a more international style. That people travel to study abroad, they go back to their countries and bring what they've learned. There's access to players from all over the world through recordings and through live concerts, traveling artists, much more than there was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And certainly in Mozart's time, he was one of the first touring artists.
Yes,
as a
but
kid.
on a smaller scale, of course, right?
He traveled pretty far
Yeah.
for those times. But even as a child, he was brought to all the capitals of Europe and played for royalty and aristocracy. And that's really what started off the whole concept of touring artists and public performance. And then that evolved throughout the course of the 19th century. I tell people that, when you play a piece of Bach, there's very little information by Bach
Right.
on the score of how to play it. No dynamic marks, no tempo marks. And I ask them, do you know why? And they usually don't know why. And I said, the reason is very simple. He was always there when his music
When
was
his
played.
music was playing, yes.
Yeah, he wasn't thinking about somebody playing it
Legacies
300
and,
years ago.
300 years
Yes,
later, no.
posterity
Yeah,
was not a
posterity,
concept
right.
that existed. So he wrote for his students. He wrote for the Sunday church service. He was teaching his students. He was playing the organ for the Sunday service or conducting the choir. And he was always there to tell people how he wanted his music to go. But, after Mozart and people started wanting to play music that they heard touring performers play, and publications started, then composers started being concerned. Well, maybe someone will want to play my music after I'm gone. I should write down how I want it to be played. And as the years progressed throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, composers became more and more specific about what they wrote down.
Let's talk, maybe a little bit more about the music that you're going to play for us. So we already briefly talked about Beethoven's 6 variations. There's 1802. We talked about that it doesn't really make much sense, to kind of pinpoint this in that particular way, that it's the kind of moving away from one tradition, classical music, to something new. The other piece that you're playing for us is from Chopin.
Barcarolle.
Yes.
It's pouring out its heart, it's just very effusive. But the year 1802 that you mentioned is the year that Beethoven wrote his variations. It's interesting from another point of view, because there's another major work on my program on Saturday night, which was written 26 years later. But both composers in 1802 and 26 years later in 1828 were about 31.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, because when Beethoven wrote his variations in 1802, and he was about 31 or 32, this is considered a very early work, and he still had like 27 more years of life left, and all of the works that, most of the famous works that we associate with Beethoven were still to come.
Yeah.
When Schubert wrote his last sonata in 1828, at about the same age, 31, he was weeks away from dying. So it's really a farewell piece. It's a piece about facing death, and people sometimes say, well, how can you call this a late sonata because it was written by a 31-year-old? But it was written by a 31-year-old who had been sick for about the last 5 or 6 years of his life, off and on, with a disease that he knew would probably bring an early demise. And then there's this rumble. Kind of an ominous rumbling in the bass, which comes several times during the piece. Is that a premonition of death? Is it the rattling of bones? Is it just, the fear in the background? But the opening is like a hymn, and it's in a hymn texture. You can imagine it being sung in church. 4-part harmony, and that's very contemplative. And the second movement is just the epitome of sadness, of just coming to terms with despair. And a little bit later, it has this kind of crying out. Just full of anguish. And then it just melts into kind of peace. Acceptance. So that movement is really the heart of the sorrow of facing death, I think. Anguish, sadness, and acceptance.
It also, though, has a kind of bit of a lingering quality that you think, like, for as long as there is all that outcry, that anguish, and all this depth of the emotions, neither the piece nor its life comes to an end. And so therefore, it's kind of meanders also in between of sorts.
Well, it's not fast, it's not rushing, it's contemplative. So the tempo is moderately slow, and the phrases are long. The whole sonata takes almost 50 minutes to play, which we consider a long time to sit for a piece of music.
That's right.
It's not a long time compared to a baseball game or going to the movies or many other things that we do. But it's long for a piece of music, and some people criticize Schubert for his length, but Schumann, who came after Schubert and was a particular admirer of Schubert, used the term heavenly length.
You know, you've in a way already answered my next question by leading us through these pieces, but, teaching music, as you've done or as we do in our school, attracts lots of students from across campus. Some are business majors, some are engineers, but they all have this passion for music. And so the question is then, how is music, or will music continue to be important for us as we are going forward into this, slightly strange 21st century? What is it that music and the musical traditions that you in particular celebrate provide us, as a way of hopefully finding our way through these slightly, at times, uncharted territories?
Well, I think the art of music becomes more and more important in our time, in our technological age, in our age of artificial intelligence. And there's been a lot of writing and speaking about the importance of music for children. Some years ago, it was a fad to say that listening to Mozart made children smarter, or studying classical music made them smarter. Well, I think some of that has been debunked,
Right.
but a lot of it is verified by studies and testing, that the study of music, because it involves discipline, because it's physical, emotional, and intellectual, it sort of brings all facets of the human being together toward a unified goal, that this is extremely helpful for children in becoming learners of any kind. The other thing about music that I think is really important in our time, when we live in an age of decreased attention span, quick change, fads, whether it's fashion or video games or whatever it is, things are changing very quickly. Children who study music quickly come to realize that they are part of a continuum of cherishing something from the past that society has come to value all over the world.
And that's recognizable,
all
wherever
over the
you go.
world, Bach and Beethoven are played and valued, even in our technological age. And it's not going away, just as Plato hasn't gone away, Shakespeare hasn't gone away, Rembrandt hasn't gone away. Yes, there will always be something new in all the arts, but I think that studying music also makes us a participant in history, because we're not just reading something in a book about history. We are bringing history alive when we
Bringing
play.
it forward, so to speak, into our own time, right?
Without the player, Beethoven and Bach is a piece of paper on a bookshelf. So, yes, it's been played already, so maybe one could say, well, do we need someone else to play it? Well, yes, we do, because when you're playing it yourself, it's a completely different experience from when you're listening to someone else play it. It's coming alive in your heart, in your mind, in your hands, in your body. So it's really a way of connecting with the best of humankind.
I knew that I wanted to let you have the last word, and so you did. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.